Okay, so what we're doing here today is we're going to do the 3D digital mock-up for a six-sided carton. As I said, it's not going to be the be-all and end-all of mock-ups, but because you guys are still being introduced to how the mock-up system works, it's the simplest way to show you in a form that you're familiar with how to do a 3D mock-up. Now what you'll notice if you go to the Blackboard shell, you'll see that there's all the files that are up there for this week. So week 13, Digital Mockup Workshop. The files that are in there are the Digital Mockup Workshop files located there. Once you've downloaded them, you'll end up with a series of different ones here. Some of them are to do with components of the job, and other ones are to do with examples of how the end result should look. So if you have a look here, you've got mockup 2D example. Now this is an example of a 2D version of the file that you can sort of add to your first 2D layout that you did when you were doing your portfolio. So when you did your first 2D layout, adding little bits like little features and stuff to it like this is something that you'll probably be able to do now given the skills that you'll learn during this tutorial. Then you've got another one in there that's mockup 3D example. Now this one's more or less what we're going to try and achieve today. So as you can see, it's a very generic shape, very generic 3D sided carton. So I guess it's just about using this technique to be able to apply it to your own form. You've got the master link there, so if you've opened up your AI file and realized that you need to, it's trying to find a link and it's not being able to find it, this is the link, so make sure that you try and link it to that. Then if you open the AI file, you'll see that inside that you've got a couple of different things here. Now, it's not exactly, you know, here's one I prepared earlier because it's not going to be what yours will look like, but what you can see here is we've got the die line semi-done. Imagine that this is the fully done finished art die line rather than just being a basic shapes die line. Then you've got your front of pack. You've got another one over here. Now this one was used for a cylindrical form of a 3D mock-up that you won't be doing today, but I mean it's still there anyway just to show you exactly how you can sort of turn that into a cylinder. Got a rasterized version of the same front of pack there, the top of pack down here, and then over here you've got another rasterized version of the three sides that we're going to be showing in our mock-up, and this will make sense later on when you get to that stage of the tutorial. And then the final thing in the folder is mock-up photo, and this is the one that we're actually going to be using to start with. So if you want to actually take that mock-up photo and open it up in Photoshop, this is what it'll look like when you've got it there in the file. So you can see it's not the greatest photo. It's looks like it's just been taken at somebody's house. Yeah, the lighting's not exactly the greatest. There's shadows. You know, it's not exactly what you'd consider to be a professional photograph, as if you were taking it for a portfolio. But that's not what we want for the purposes of this mock-up. What we're actually extracting from this is we're using this as the base to start off our 3D mock-up. So what it's offering us is the angle at which the carton is being presented, the shadows at which it's displaying. So you can see that the front there is the lightest. It's got the most highlight on it because it's against the light source. Then it's slightly darker on the top and then most dark on the left side. But for all intents and purposes, this photograph is a JPEG. So in good finished art form, and how I'll expect you to present it when you finally submit it for your brief submission, you'll need to start up a new file. So if you just go Command N, that'll bring up your new dialog box. We'll name this one, we'll use the proper naming convention that you'll be using. So it'll be 3D design underscore, what was it again? 3, yep, so group A or B, then the project, this one will be your 3D mockup, and then your last name. Now you can change the preset to be international paper, and then we'll change that to A5 as the size. Now, the thing is this is not going to be printed out, but I'll just explain to you what we're going to be doing here and how this will be different to how you've probably been taught it before. What we've got is we've got an international paper size here of the A5 paper size. The width and height are uniform. But you can see that what it may have done with the preset is it's left it as RGB and the resolution as 300. Now we're going to keep it that way. Contrary to what would have been said in the other classes where the screen resolution is 72 ppi, having it at 300 means that you'll notice the Retina display models the Mac have these days. Those display models I think are actually displaying at 150 ppi, so there are quite a more dramatic increase on the pixel resolution, at least double. So my thought is, rather than actually having it at screen resolution, I'll leave it at 300, so your print resolution, but with an RGB color mode, just so that we can submit it digitally. You don't need to actually submit this as a print form. Then with your background contents, you can either choose to have it as transparent or white. I'm going to have it as transparent, and the color profile for the job I just put as the working RGB there, and then you can click OK. So now what you've got is the template for the final submission that you'll do of your 3D mockup. Go back to your mockup photo JPEG. Now what I want you to do is I want you to click on the image. So click and hold down Shift, then drag that image across to your new file and drop it in that space. Now the reason I got you to hold down Shift was because it'll hold it uniformly within the frame of the existing image. So what I mean by that is that if I hold down Shift, when it drops it in here, it drops it in exactly the center of where it would be in this file. So you can see that it's left a relatively uniform space around the left, right, top, and bottom. So it's nice and centered in that space. And I would say that this is about the space that you want to leave, the negative space you want to leave around your final form when it gets to that stage. Then just so that we're keeping up with our proper finished art methods, you want to probably delete that first layer that you've got and rename the new image that you've got there as reference image. So as I said before, we're going to use this image as the basis of the carton that we're doing. Now, obviously that means that it's kind of cut out half your job, because you don't really need to actually create this from scratch. It doesn't force you to create the angles. You'll print out your die line when you get to the stage of having mocked up and completed your die line in Illustrator. You'll print it out, you'll cut it up, you'll put it together, and then you'll take this photograph. So that's how you'll achieve this stage. Once you've done that, you'll do what we've just done then and drag it into this file. Then you need to go to your AI file. Now you'll see in the AI file here, we're imagining that this die line here will contain all the graphics that you've done and your final design on all those sides of the carton. Now, you'll need to extract your front of pack image from that die line. So whether or not that means that you'll need to create a clipping mask and take it out, in one way or another, you'll need to extract it as this one has been done here. Now you can see that this one here is just by itself, so whether or not all you do is you just copy it to the side of your artboard or you create a new artboard, whatever works for you, so that you can just take that off. Then what we'll do is, since this one's already been masked out, you'll just get your standard selection tool, so V. You'll select that front of pack, and you'll see that because it's been properly clipping masked and collected within that mask, that should just select around the outside of the front of pack. Then you go Command C to copy it, go back to Photoshop and go Command V. Now when it pops up with the dialog box, you've got a couple of options here. Smart Object you've obviously been familiar with from having done some stuff in Lee's class. Smart Object is ordinarily quite great because it means that you can retain the original format of the AI file that you've brought in. The only problem with it in this context is that a smart object isn't malleable enough for us to be able to push it into the form that we needed to. We needed to distort it beyond its ability to be changed or brought back to its original stage. So instead what you'll do is you'll choose pixels, you'll go OK. Now it'll look quite odd when it comes in because what it does when you paste it in is this front of pack has been masked, and because it's been masked it means that this copy from Illustrator is collecting all the images that have been masked out. Now since they're behind the mask they're obviously not visible, but they're still being collected in this copy. So don't worry too much. The only time that you'll have to worry is if you've accidentally collected, say down the bottom here you might have a random arbitrary shape that was off your artboard that you've accidentally selected. So be sure to check to see whether or not that's part of it. The other thing to mention about it being brought in is that the size of it when it comes in is generally the size that it is when it's been copied from your original source. Now you don't want to reduce it any smaller than the size that you'll want to distort it to. So what I mean by that is, let's just say hypothetically you bring this in and it comes in at this side and you're like, oh yeah, cool, I can just drop that in, and if I just conform that and let it go, then it should be sweet. But what you'll notice is then when I go to try and increase that, the pixel resolution has obviously undergone what's referred to as a lossy transformation, which means that by bringing it up, it's trying to increase the amount of pixels to the size that it's at. So it's lost resolution. So instead, you need to just reduce it so that if it comes in at this size, obviously you want to bring it down, but you don't want to reduce it any smaller than the size that you'll want to distort it to. So in this case, I just want to bring it down so that it's probably around about as big as what that front of pack face of the original photograph looks like. And then you'll just click enter. Now what enter does in this stage is it means that when I now go Command T and I can transform it again, instead of the confines being around the entire edge of that big wasteful space, the confines of the transform path are just around the outside of the front of pack digital design there. And what I'll get you to do now is hold down Command and click on the top left corner and drag that into the top left corner of the front of pack. Again, Command click in the bottom corner, drag that down to the bottom corner of the pack, the bottom left corner. Bottom right corner to the bottom right corner of the front of pack, and the top right corner to the top right corner of the front of pack. Now don't commit to the transform just yet. Don't press enter is what I mean. Because as you can see, that even though we've now conformed this to the front of pack, there's things such as this little bulbous section down the bottom here that's bowing out. Now when it comes to doing these 3D mock-ups, you can choose to do it one of two ways. You can choose to do it where you create a form that looks really rigid and looks as if it's perfectly done as a box. But we all know that when you do a box or when a box is on shelf, it's not going to look that uniform. There's still going to be bulbs, there's still going to be bits coming out, it's not going to quite look perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make it so that this bottom section here conforms to that bulb that's come out in the bottom front of pack. So to do that, you go up to Edit, you go to Transform, and you go Warp. Now what Warp does is it takes the existing free transform and puts a grid on it so that you can just simply click and drag the sections that you want so that they conform to the size that you want. Now be careful when doing this, because when you're working with a design, obviously you've got text on there, you've got images on there, and you don't want to distort it out of whack so that eventually it ends up looking like all the text is unreadable, the image looks really bad. You know, like for instance, if I'm to pull that right out there, you know, obviously that's a little bit bizarre and the text is illegible, etc., etc. So you want to just pinch it and move it in a way that it just conforms to that space. And then you can test the top and see. You might have to pull that down a little bit just to see if there's any warp going on there that you can conform to. And once you're happy with it, commit to the transformation by just clicking enter. So if you've already guessed, that is the process that we're going to do in all three sides. So if we go back to our Illustrator file, since we don't have a side of pack, obviously on your pack you're going to have your, you can either choose your left or right side of pack depending on which side it corresponds with the photograph angle that you've taken. But since we don't have a side of pack for this tutorial, I'm just going to use the same front of pack as our side of pack. So go back to your Illustrator, copy that, select that front of pack, Command C to copy it, come back into Photoshop, Command V to paste it. Remember to keep with the pixels in your paste. Go OK. Reduce it down only so far as it's just slightly bigger than the side of pack that you're working with. Conform it by clicking enter. Then free transform it again by going Command T. Another way that you can do that if you want to do it the full way is to actually just go edit free transform. Then holding down Command, click and dragging that into the corners of the side of pack. Now there's just a couple of differences between the front of pack and the side of pack and how you conform it. The first one is you have to make sure that you align your left side of pack or your right side of pack, depending on the angle, exactly with this edge. Now, if you need to, in order for there not to be a gap, do a small overlap, then do that. So whether or not it's a 1 to 2 pixel overlap there on the front of pack, that's probably ideal. So just make sure that there's a tiny overlap there, not so much, but just a little bit. Then the other thing too is the top left corner. Now what I was saying before with regards to the human qualities of the pack occurs the same when it comes to errors with the pack. Now you'll see in this top left here that there's an open latch in the top. So when this photograph was originally taken, the top was not fully stuck in. Now I know that when we did the first brief, a few of you did photographs and you opted to do the photograph to try and get a head start on portfolio, or even just for submission you decided to do that. Now that's cool that you did those photographs, but what would have been ideal is when you see errors in that, so when you've done your photograph and you see little white lines or latches that don't connect, then the post-production should have been a part of that, and going into Photoshop and cleaning that up and ensuring that the client saw it as if it was the best version of the job. So rather than leaving those little like cracking lines and latches that weren't quite fully connected, glue marks, etc., the idea is to try and change that. Now with your 3D digital mock-up, you can do that. So because I'm deciding to exercise creative control over this 3D mock-up, instead of leaving that latch where it is, I'm going to bring it up so that it then aligns with the top there. So rather than leaving it so that instead the logical way would to be to put it there and leave that latch open, I want to close it. So I'm going to bring it up to the top there and align it up there. Then just as before, you'll go to Edit, you go to Transform, you'll go to Warp, and in warping it, you'll just make it conform to the bulbous areas of the pack. Now with the top here, you can either choose to leave it so that there's a gap, or you can close the gap just a little bit. And I'm going to opt to do that just a little bit because it seems like that's quite a large latch opening there that I want to reduce it down. So just so that there's a little bit left, but not a huge rift there. And then after I'm happy, I'll just go enter to conform that to that shape. And then the only other thing is to the top of pack. So you'll go back to your AI file. Down the bottom here, you'll see the top of pack here as the square. You'll select that, Command C, go back to your Photoshop file, Command V, again pixels, reduce it so that it's only slightly bigger than the side of pack that you're working with. And because this one's going to be distorted a lot more, I might want to leave it just a little bit bigger than the other sides. Click enter, go Command T to open up the free transform. So now the conforming path is just around the outside of the side of pack that I'm using. Hold down, Command click and drag each corner so that they conform to those areas there. Now this side or the top here is going to have to undergo a little bit more warping, as well as making sure that each of those alignments with the front of pack and the side of pack are without gaps. So since I'm happy with that as it is at that stage, I'll go Edit, Transform, Warp, and I'll start to bring it up so that it's looking more like it's the latch on the lid. Now make sure that when you do the left side and you're pinching that up, obviously you want to make sure that the right side's done at a relatively similar angle so that that warp over the top, that angle replicates that angle of the latch, looking like it's open a little bit. And in my case, since I've distorted the front so that it pops down a little bit, I'm going to have to warp this so that it overlaps ever so slightly along the edge of that front of pack as well. And I've left a little gap there, so you can see that little gap, and then the edge lines up there with the edge of that photograph. And then once I'm happy with that, just enter. So what you can see there is essentially that's the bare bones of what we're going to be working with to try and get this looking schmicko. So now that we've dragged all our three layers, you'll see them in the layer there. The structure is the front of pack, the side of pack, and the top of pack. So just as they are, you'll rename them like that as well. So your front of pack will be FOP, your side of pack you'll call SOP, and your top of pack will just be TOP. Now, you'll want to create a white layer underneath this, because the thing with the reference image is that obviously you don't want to see it all the time, because you can get to the end and realize there's gaps missing and there's all sorts of weird little bits that you didn't see because the background image is taking away from this 3D mock-up you're trying to create. Now ordinarily, I'm sure a lot of you are quite used to just getting a new layer, getting the paint bucket and adding your color to that paint bucket, to that layer there. So if I just demonstrate that now, you don't follow along with this because I'm going to show you why that's probably not the most optimal way to do it. But doing it like this, where you've just got a brand new layer and you'll paint drop in that. Now, that's fine. Ordinarily, it seems okay to sort of do that method, but it's not really ideal in terms of the versatility that you have with doing it in proper finished art. So you can see here that once I've paint dropped that, it's just a shape. It's just movable as a shape. It's fully destroyed in that space, and it's conformed to the artboard and the art area that you've got there. Instead, what I'm going to get you to do to create just a standard layer, and this is just proper finished art more than anything, is I'll get you to go down the bottom here to where it says Adjustment Layer, go to Solid Color at the top. Now, since we're working in RGB, just for your information, 255 across RG and B equals white, whereas 0 across RG and B equals black. Now, if you change all the values the same all the way through, that'll be grey. So if it's 100, 100, 100, that'll be a darker grey versus 200, 200, 200, which will be a lighter grey. So we'll leave it at white, so 255. Now what you can see here is that it does two things. It creates the colour, so every time I want to change that colour, I can go back in here and I can just simply change it by changing that colour in the breakdowns here. But also a layer mask, so it means that if I mess up, that's just a layer mask. I can just white it out, start again. So it's versatile, it can be used in a lot more ways than just simply paint dropping a pixel layer. And then you'll name this one background color. So you can see there that now we've got the white behind it, we can actually see what we're doing, and you can have a look, cast your eyes across each edge and see whether or not there's any gaps. I can see that on my job there's no gaps except for the latch opening here on the left, which is what we want. So my job's okay, but if you notice on yours that there's a gap between your side of pack and your front of pack, then it makes sense for you to align those properly and make sure that they're all well and truly connected. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to work on some of the features that you'll notice that if you open up the 3D example here, you can see some of those features there that have been created in that prior example. So what we're going to work with first is some of the highlights. Sorry, no, actually we'll start with the shadows. So if you go back to your Illustrator file, one way to be able to do the shadows is if you go down to the bottom here of that file that you've got this rasterized version of kind of the mock version of that 3D pack. So this grey panel along the top and the darker grey panel along the left side of pack are replicating the sides of pack in this job. Now what you could do, which it's just a suggestion but it's not recommended, is you could create the shapes in Illustrator and you could copy them across to your Photoshop file and paste them over the top of each side of the 3D mock-up that you're creating. Now the issues with that is that you have to then distort it. So if you copy the shape and you take it across, you have to distort it to these pack sides, and sometimes they won't align, it's not perfectly uniform, and you have to try and get it perfectly aligned with that. So rather than this trial and error process, it'd be easier to be able to control it more in Photoshop and more within the context of this actual mock-up itself, rather than working between the two programs to create the shadows. So just before I do that, I'm going to create a folder for each of the sides of pack. So if you go down the bottom here, you can see your folders. So create a new group. Make a new group folder that corresponds with each side of pack that you're doing. So FOP, SOP, and TOP. And then drag the corresponding layer into that folder. And the reason we're doing this is if you're working with heaps of layers and you kind of find yourself going, I don't really know where stuff is, I haven't labeled them properly, this is becoming messy, this is a good way to just from the start make sure everything is nice and easy to locate and easy to manage. A further easy way to do that is to just right click on the eye and change the color of each group so that you've got a nice easy stacking order that not only is named and put into folders but also is color coded. That's nice and easy to come back to. It's only a recommendation. I don't expect to see your files like this at the end, but just for ease of use, it's probably nice so that you've got them all set up in their corresponding structures. So since the front of pack is the lightest area, you can see there that that front of pack has the lightest area. It's against the window. The top of pack has the darker shadow, and then the left side of pack has the most shadow. So we're going to try and do the same thing. So since our front of pack has no shadow, we're going to start with the top because we don't need to create any shadow for the front of pack. So to create the shadow for the top of pack, you'll go to your TOP folder or group. You'll go Command and click on the actual image on the top, in the top folder. That'll create marching ants that'll go around the outside of your top of pack pixel graphic there. Then just as before, when I was showing you how solid colors work, you'll go down to the adjustment layers, you'll go solid color. Now because we want this to be a light shadow, but a shadow that's still lighter than the side of pack, you'll want to probably just do it at a reasonable shadow. So it might be around about 200. So again, as I said before, 200 across the board creates a gray. So then if you do that in the R, the G, and the B, and get in the practice of doing it using the numbers rather than the image and the sliders here, that way you know exactly the values. 200, 200, 200 in RGB, and click OK. Then you'll just go up to the top here where your blending modes are and click multiply. Ta-da! And that's your shadow for your top of pack. So what's happened there is not only is it created on a layer mask where we can fully control that, and you can see that the edges of that around that are exactly the same edges as the top of pack, but we can also change that color at any point. So if you go, oh, it's looking a bit dark, then you can change the density of that shadow so that it's just a little bit lighter. So I can just come back in here and simply change it up. So that's your multiply, and that's your shadow on the top. Then you'll do the same for the side of pack. So you come down here, you'll click on your layer, you'll go Command, click, so that it creates the marching ants around the pixel graphic on the side of pack there. Go to your adjustment layers, go solid layer, then make this one about 180, because this one's going to be darker than the other one, but obviously you don't want it to be too dark. Click OK, and then change your blending mode to be multiply. And you can see already that this is starting to take shape and starting to look more like a three-dimensional mock-up. So now that we've got our shadows there, or at least the basis of our shadows, we want to try and bring in some highlights as well. So you can see here on our 3D example that the highlights are on the front of pack. We've got a little highlight along the top of pack, and then we've got these highlights running along the edges of our corner here, coming into our 1-point perspective. Now what you can see in terms of how this highlight comes is more or less intuitive to where the light source is. So if we're imagining that this front of pack, like the lightest part here is here, this is the slightly darker, and then the darkest again, the light source is around about here, because the light spills from the top across to the back. So although it sounds like it's, for me saying that, it just sounds like it's unnecessary to know, it's important to know in terms of where you want the light coming from. If you wanted the light coming from over here, it would cast a shadow across your front of pack, which would mean your front of pack wouldn't have the focus in the job. So thinking about it intuitively, you want to know and you want to see the most important thing on the pack. If your side of pack contains DI tabs and a whole bunch of mandatory information, it's not that pretty, then the shadow on that side of pack is probably important. Making sure that you block it off more than you make importance of that front of pack. So we're going to try and replicate that with our highlights here. So we'll start with the top of pack. Now, just as before, since we've actually already got our shadow layer here, we'll just duplicate that. Now you can do that in a couple of ways. You can go up to the top here and you can go duplicate layer, and that'll create a duplicate of that using the fill, etc., etc. You can hold down Option, click and drag, and that'll create that new layer. or you can just go Command J, and that will create a duplicate. Either one's fine, doesn't necessarily matter, it just depends on your preference for what you prefer to use. Then we'll go into the color, so you just double click on the color there. You'll go 255, which is completely white. Go OK. Obviously nothing much has happened. The reason being is that our blending mode is still set to multiply. Now multiply creates almost like a fusion with the shape underneath it, so that it actually multiplies the effect, so it creates a darker look. Instead, we want to actually screen it, because screen is almost the inverse of multiply, so it takes all the lightest spots and boosts the lightness in them. Now you'll see there that obviously the screening mode is quite intense. Since it's white, it's just literally going to be white on the top there. So what we're going to do now is get our brush tool. And you can get that over here. If you have a look here, you can see under the spot healing brush, you'll see brush. And you want the brush. You don't want any of the other ones under this tool kit here. You just want brush. So you can just get it by clicking B, and that's fine. Now you got to make sure that you've got your layer mask selected, because that's the area we're affecting. Check to see that your hardness is set to 0. So if you go up to the top left here, you'll see your size and hardness as well as your shape options here. Shape options aren't necessarily important, because we just want it to be a radial circle, so you can just do the hardness as 0, and then the size of it you'll increase by just holding down your right bracket on your keypad to increase, or your left bracket to decrease. And you can remove a bit of that layer mask so that it creates almost this sort of diffusion there. So you can see there that it just leaves that light spot, because that's the area that we want to affect when we're doing our highlight. Now you can see that on the layer mask when you actually click Option click on the layer mask, which will mean it'll isolate only the layer mask, and you'll be able to see how much of the layer mask you've blocked out. Now something I forgot to mention is you do need to make sure that with your brush you have the color that you're wanting to block out as your foreground color. So you can see here that my foreground color is set to black. So if I go to my layer mask and I click, it blocks it out, because on the layer mask the black is the area that's blocking out. Now obviously if I set that to white as my foreground color here down in my bottom foreground and background section, that would just blow it out of proportion. So you can see there that it's created more white, because it's created the white area, which is where our color is actually being created. So that's just an FYI for you. So make sure that you've got that set to black so it blocks it out instead of actually creating more color. Then since that's set to screen, we can see that that highlight's probably a bit intense. Probably seems like that light source is actually just right beside the product. So instead we want to actually just bring that down a little bit. So you can go up the top here of our layers, and you've got your opacity and your fill. You can either choose your opacity or fill to reduce, but I'm going to go with fill, and I'm going to take that down to around about 35, maybe even 40. And so that just creates a diffusion there of light. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see that that's just created a little light source there along the top. So what we'll do is we'll do the same thing on the front of pack as well. Now if we're imagining, as I said before, that the light source is more predominantly kind of top right here, we want to have the highlight spreading and vignetting down the front of pack. So you'll go to your front of pack. Now we haven't actually created a shadow layer for this. So instead, we're just going to be creating our highlights layer. So just as before, you'll go Command click on the front of pack to create those marching ants. You'll go down to your adjustment layers, go solid color. That's now set to 255, so it's white. Go OK. Then change your blending mode to be screen, go to your layer mask, and again go over to your brush tool. Make sure that you set your foreground color to the color that you want to block out of your layer mask there. Increase using your right bracket to create a brush that's maybe about maybe about 2/3 the front of your pack size. And then using your discretion, just brush out as much as you feel is necessary to create that light source being in the top right of the front of pack. And as I said, if you option click on the layer mask, you'll be able to see for yourself exactly how much of that light source, of that layer mask you've affected. And then just as before, just to finally finish it off, reduce the color or the fill, the opacity or the fill to the amount that you feel is necessary. Now you can play around with the blending modes if you feel. Sometimes, in this case, you can see that it's not exactly like a bright light sort of feel to it. It feels a little bit like a flat light that's coming over the top of the product, so it doesn't really feel that realistic. So if you want to fiddle around, try and work within these blending modes here. So these lighten blending modes, some of them are really going to blow your job out and look quite intense and probably just create almost the effect of a contrast there and make those colors really vibrant. So you probably don't want that. But I mean, something like overlay can sometimes be nice on the right surface. I just prefer to stick with screen because it's quite easy to use, and it creates almost the difference between an uncoated and a coated stock when you do it. Speaking of which, what you'll notice from the 3D example is that it probably looks like it's about a mix between both, uncoated and coated. And the reason that is because if you zoom in on that, you can see that they've got this almost textured effect over the top. And that's done using noise in Photoshop. Now, you can either use noise or you can use the default effects that they've got going on. I'll show you how to use the default effects, and that might be enough to sort of create the effect that you want. So using our front of pack, and I'll only show this on your front of pack because you can replicate it in your own time on each of the sides of the pack there. But if you go to your front of pack here, what we're going to do now is we're going to go down the bottom here to add a layer style, so the one that's a little icon of the FX, and click on Bevel and Emboss. Now this is going to be a dual prong approach because not only are we going to be able to create the texture that we want to create to kind of replicate that uncoated stock feel, but it's also going to give us the three-dimensional look of the front of pack as well, so it gives that shape depth, you know. So when you're working with this, there's good and bad ways to work with it. Default is the bad way to work with it, but controlling it and understanding how each of the sections work is probably the best way that filters work in Photoshop. So the inner bevel is the best. You can play around with the others in your own time, but inner bevel is probably the best to work with for this in this context. Smooth is fine. Depth at 100 is also fine. Direction up is fine. The ones that are important are the size and the soften values. Now you don't want the front of pack to be insane. Like if you change this to be 50, I mean, no pack is that bulbous, no pack is that intensely rounded. It's just unrealistic. So you want to work probably under 10 pixels, if not less. I'm going to create my size here to be 6 pixels because I feel like that's a nice amount of bend around the edges there. But then I'm also going to soften it about half that. So that if you toggle on and off your preview, you can see that it just creates a nice sort of simple rounded edge. The only other thing that you'll notice is that the shadow area is set to the bottom right. which is wrong because our light source is coming in from this side. So you always have to think about that light source and go, well shit, if that light source is going to be coming in from the top right, to have this dark shadowy edge on that area seems wrong. It's counterintuitive to the light source. And this is where this bit down the bottom comes into play, where your global light is. What global light means in this, and the reason that it's ticked, is that that source will be the same for every single light shading area that you do on every single side of pack. So if I set it to global light, it means that the same global light will be for the top of pack and the side of pack when I decide to do those. So you don't actually want that because the light source is different on every side. So click that off. And then if we're thinking about where the light source is, obviously you can see on this circle it gives a great visual representation of where the light's coming from. So it seems like it's coming from down here because the light's striking there and then casting a shadow down here. We don't want that. We instead want it to be the opposite of that, coming from up here and down there. So all we do is simply click on the right side of the circle and it creates that effect. So you've now got the shadow on the left side and the highlight on the top right corner. What you'll notice is that that edge is incredibly dark and probably a little bit too dark for that shadow to have cast along there. So always thinking about how the light will hit it is very important to make sure that you make it look as realistic as possible. So we can see that our screening mode's actually not too bad. It's quite light. We could probably boost it a little bit. So if you go to your opacity of your highlight mode and make that 75%, it'll boost the light spot. You can make it lighter if you feel it needs to be lighter, but I'll keep mine at 75. And then in the shadow mode, we'll actually change this so that the opacity instead is down to about 25, even less. Might even want to do it down to 10. And you can either choose that by changing the color, so you could change that color to be a lighter gray, or you can change it using the opacity as I just did then and reduce that to 10% of the black. And that's not too bad. It's subtle. It's not pronounced. It's not intense. It's just subtle. Then to create that effect, as I was saying before, of the uncoated stock, we'll go down here to texture. And you can already see that the default texture is actually not too bad. It creates this kind of nice, sort of subtle, uncoated feel to the front of pack. Now, if you're doing a coated stock, obviously this texture will not apply to you. But in doing an uncoated stock, it's quite nice to add this little effect there. You can go into the patterns there and you'll see that you'll probably have a few different options. You've got some that look quite intense. Like if you look at this one here that I've got selected now, that's quite an intense pattern. You can even add your own into there and your own textures into there. I won't show you how to do that during this tutorial because I feel like the default is actually quite good. So find one that works for you out of, say, these 4 here. If you've got these default 4, I'm going to keep it subtle. So I'm actually going to go with the second one here that's in my options. Now, all you really need to do is actually work with the scale. So if I make the scale larger, it makes the size of the pores larger. So it obviously creates the more intense effect of the uncoated feel and that really tactile sort of feel to it. So in fact, I'm actually just going to reduce them below 100. So I'll make it 80. And that feels like it's got enough of a texture, but not enough to really detract from the design, because you still want the design to be the pronounced thing. And then you can click OK. And you'll see that it doesn't really look like much from a distance, but it creates that nice sort of subtle texture over the top of it, which is in line with probably our uncoated stock that we've got here at the college. Now you can fiddle with that, change that, work with those. That's just like me introducing you to those dialog boxes there. So you can work with those in your own leisure, that's fine, but that's just me showing you how they work. Now the only other thing when it comes to working with the highlights that I'll show you for today is this highlight along the edge. So you've got a highlight there that runs along the 3 edges furthermost to the what's presumed to be the camera. And we're going to try and create that here. So For us to do that, it's obviously not going to fall under any of our 3 folders there. We want to do it above all 3. So you'll go up here to the top where you, down the bottom here of your layers where you've got the adjustment layer. You'll go solid color. White is what you want, so you'll just leave it at 255. Now you see it's obviously just completely consumed the entire job, made the entire job opaque. For us to see what we're doing, click on the layer mask there, and we want to actually reverse it. We want to inverse that. So you can just go Command I on the layer mask, and it'll just hide it. It'll just turn it black, which means that the entire layer mask there itself has been blocked out, and you can't see the color there. Then I'll get you to zoom in on the edge that you're working with. Now you can do this in a number of different ways, but I'll just show you one way to do this today. Go up to your left-hand side list of options there, your tools over here on your left-hand side. Just hold and click down on your lasso tool and select Polygonal Lasso Tool. Now the reason we're using this today is because our edges are very straight and very uniform, and the Polygonal Lasso Tool uses lines to snap to create our marquee and our marching ants. So what we're going to do is we're going to straddle this edge here. So this overlap between the left-hand side of pack and the front of pack is what we're trying to get. So we want to actually just straddle this overlap. So we'll start by clicking on the left-hand side, maybe 1 or 2 pixels from that edge, pulling it down all the way, following in parallel with the edge there to the bottom, and then clicking again approximately 1 to 2 pixels from that edge down the bottom. Then doing the same across, so dragging it across so that it straddles the right-hand side now of the front of pack, clicking that, following that back up, clicking at the top here so that then joins like that. So you can see that what's happened is our marching ants are now overlapping the side of pack and the front of pack. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually just remove that from our layer mask. So to do that, you want to make sure that white is in your foreground color. So if you've got your 2 colors, your foreground and your background down in your bottom left there, as you can see there, make white your foreground color, and then go Option Delete. Now if you go Option Delete, that deletes from your foreground color. If you go Command Delete, that deletes your background color. So that'll color it with your background color. So if I actually went Command Delete on that, that would just create more black in that space like that. So if you've gone Option Delete with your white in the foreground, it should block that out of your layer mask. And you can just go Command D, which will deselect those marching ants. So now, if I Option click on my layer mask, I can see that that tiny little slither of a highlight is now being cut out of my layer mask. So what I'll get you to do now is to do the similar thing along the front. So if you go and select on one side of the top of pack there, get it to run along that edge. Now if it's bulbous and you've got a slight kink in it, you might need to create a couple of clicks along the way so it follows that path. Click along the end there, and then 1 to 2 pixels on the opposite side of that edge so that it straddles that edge. Once you've got that selected along that edge, you select your layer mask, you go Option Delete with your white in the foreground, you go Command D, and that deselects it. Now along this edge, along the left edge, remember what I was saying before about the light source. This gap here means that this top latch is actually going to be casting a shadow across this bottom lip of the left side of pack. So instead of putting our highlight along there, we actually just want to put it along the top edge only. So not the bottom edge. So this one here, we want just on the top there. So again, if you get your Polygonal Lasso tool, select below the edge, but so that it doesn't touch that side of pack, the top of that side of pack, and then has a small overlap over your edge on the top. And then having your layer mask selected on your highlights and your white as your foreground color, you'll go Option Delete and create that final highlight on that edge. So what it'll look like at the end is that each edge should look as if they're not fully connected because this white line is breaking it up. So if I go Option Click on my layer mask, you can see here that it creates this weird looking Y shape along all those edges there. So you can see that that's almost replicating the highlights. Now the only problem with this is that it looks very sharp, very angular. The highlight itself is very, it's not realistic. So in order for us to make this more realistic, we're going to want to blur those edges so that they look a little bit more like the light's actually just bouncing off that corner there. So having your layer mask selected, go up to Filter, go to Blur, Gaussian Blur. You don't want to do this too much because if you do too much of a blur, it's not going to be visible. So you can see there already that by just simply doing 10 pixels, that's too much for it to cope with, and that diffused light on the edge is just a little bit too intense. So what we're going to do instead is we want to do it below 0.1 pixel. So even 0.6, maybe 7, somewhere around there, where it's just a slight diffusion of that light, a slight blurring of the light. You might even go up to 1 if you feel like that's a nice sort of diffusion of the light along the edge, and then you'll go, okay. And so you'll see now that instead of that intense edge, it's just a little softer. The other thing too to notice is going back again to that age-old light setting, you'll notice that when light hits a box, it doesn't hit it uniformly around all the edges. It's not going to actually leave the same light there as the same light there as the same light down here. So we want to mask out some of our areas that the light probably wouldn't hit as intensely. So getting your brush tool, by either clicking B or going over to your left-hand tool palettes, make sure that your foreground color is set to black this time, because remember, we're going to be masking it out. We're going to be blocking it from our mask in the top highlights. Zoom in on these areas here. You probably reduce your brush down so that it's not nearly as big as you had it to begin with for your highlights on the front. And the first place we'll start is in this back corner. Now you can see there that we've created this light source that comes from the top right down and diffuses to the back here. So by the time it reaches the back, it's not going to still be there. So we'll just block out some of that. And you can see that if I go to my layer mask, just by simply doing that, it's created this light sort of vignette going from the darkest shadow at the back across to the forward light source at the front. Then the other thing that we'll do as well is by selecting our layer mask here, whoa, sorry, my bad. I would say that in the bottom front of pack where the highlight hits is actually not too bad. I want to leave this space down here. So you can see just down here, I probably want to leave that, and I want to leave that there. But instead, I want to get rid of the middle. So with, again, your brush selected, black is your foreground color, and your brush probably about 2/3 the front of the pack, you just simply click once in that middle highlight reel, and what it'll do is you can see there it creates almost this light source down to shadow, then back to light again in the bottom corner. So that's looking alright now. You can start to see that it's taking shape. Now you can create other highlights. If you've got things like a viewing window on your pack with acetate in it, and you want to create that sheen that comes across it, you can use this technique for that. So you can use those highlight spots. You can just get yourself a bit of light color there and just add that to that. and just try and get it using, looking realistic, just simply using those techniques. It's not using any of the default features that Photoshop has because they're awful. You can control them to an extent, but controlling them even more by simply just using color layers and blending modes and adjustment layers, you should be fine. So now, the last thing that I'm going to do on this pack is actually create the shadow underneath it. So the shadow, well first I'll create the shadow and then I'll create a reflection of that on there. So the shadow, you don't want to use the default shadow. So the drop shadow that you use sometimes when you create, say you're doing text and you want to drop shadow on it, that default drop shadow is pretty archaic. My advice is to do it yourself. So again, since we've done the highlights outside of those groups, you'll probably want to do the shadow outside of the groups because it's not part of any of the layers. So we'll do it at the bottom of the stacking order of all our images there. Now, we're not going to be simply able to just get our press command and click on a shape here because there are no shapes for the bottom area here. We're going to have to replicate or imagine what that shape looks like. So if you go down to adjustment layers, go solid color, make the shadow around about 200. Go to your layer mask there that you've got as part of that shadow. Go Command I so that it inverses that, that layer mask so that it's hidden now, fully blocked. Then we'll go up to our, again, polygonal lasso tool and follow the edges of the left side of pack and the front side of pack like this. So you want to follow it round so that it follows those two sides as we've already got them there. And then as it goes backwards, we want to try and imagine what it would look like if it was to go back and connect with the corner. So if you can see there in my example, if you go maybe back about that far, so as if you're replicating this side of the pack, so maybe up to about there. You don't have to create any sort of like imagine that it would follow any warped edges, but just a simple click in that back corner and then connect it again with this one here. So it creates this almost quasi base of pack. Then with your layer mask selected on your shadow, make sure you got your white selected in your foreground color and you'll go Option Delete. Now you won't be able to see it. If you go Command D to deselect it, you won't be able to see it because it's behind your image there. But if I go Option Click on that layer mask there, you'll be able to see that that now is created as a shape. So with that shape selected and with that layer selected, what I mean is just get your keypad and press the directional arrow down. Drop it just enough so that it doesn't look like it's floating, but it looks like it's just a little bit away from the base of the pack there. So you might have to nudge it a few times so that it drops down to around about the level that you can see in my display there. Then just as before, as we were doing with the creating the diffusion of the light on the highlight on the front of pack there, you'll select your layer mask there, you go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and this time you probably want to blur it a little more. So we're going to do that maybe about 4 pixels is pretty good. And you go OK. So now that you've got that, that's created a light source that comes down and creates this shadow underneath the pack. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to do 2 of those. So if you go Command J on that shadow, or as I said before, there's multiple other ways for you to duplicate that, but Command J will duplicate that shadow so that it just creates an extra version on the top of it. Change your color, so double click on the color, do that to be about 100, so it's nice and dark, and then nudge it back up so that that shadow falls just just under the pack, so it's just visible. Now it might seem a bit weird for you to do that, but what it's done is it's created two sort of shadows underneath there. One that's really close to where the bottom of the pack is, so that you can see that that's dark around that edge there. And what you might want to do is you might want to actually sharpen that edge a little more, because that edge is going to be diffused quite a lot. It's been blurred 4 pixels. So you might want to even go in here and go along to your left panel there, and you'll see if you hold and click down on what looks like the little droplet, you can go in there and there's a sharpen tool. And you can click on that edge and drag along that edge so that it sharpens it a little bit more. And then that'll mean that that edge is a little sharper along the base there, so you can actually see, so it looks like that darker shadow is running along the exact base of the pack. And then you've got this double extra shadow around the outside there that looks like it's just spilled out a little bit. Now, again, you can play with that. This is just an example, so you can work with that to your heart's content and see what works for you. Another shadow, which I won't show you how to do, but using that same method there, you could probably figure out how to do it, is one casting backwards. Now, the only reason I'm not going to show you how to do that is because, as you can see in this example that is available on the blackboard there, this shadow is somewhat distracting. It's a white background with a darker shadow. At the very least, it should be a lighter shadow because it's dark. It's detracting from the design itself. So when you're doing your shadows, you don't want the shadow to be too intense that it takes away from the actual product itself, because the product is the main focus. And that's why I've tried to ensure that when you're using textures, you minimize them, and when you're using your highlights and your distortions, you really don't warp your original design. Because as much as you want to create a three-dimensional version, you don't want it to be something that looks like it's fake, it's plastic, and it's not representative of the final product. So now the final thing that I'm going to show you to do, actually just before I do that, you'll see up the top here that we've got our gap here. You can see that latch gap there, and because it's white, it's unrealistic. It seems like inside the pack creates just a huge light bulb or something that's on in there. It wouldn't be white inside that pack, it'd be a lot darker. So we need to just make it look realistic by making that darker. And for us to do that, we need to go to since our side of pack is below our top of pack, and it's below our front of pack, make sure that it's set that way, because we want to create the shadow so that it's behind everything. It looks like it's inside the box. So to do that, you want to go to your adjustment layer, go to solid color again. Now this one you want to be a dense color, so you want it to be maybe around about 50. So it's not completely black, but it's dark. Then you'll drop that down so that it's below the side of pack, but it's inside that layer there, that group. Click on the layer mask and go Command I. And we're actually just going to create an arbitrary shape that gives us enough room so that it's covering this gap here. So if I get my polygonal lasso tool and just create a shape that almost blocks up that area there, so you can see that it's nothing too special. It's not going to be seen anyway, so it doesn't have to be amazing. And then again, make sure that your foreground color is set to white, and you go Option Delete, Command D to deselect, and you've closed that gap. It's that simple. And you can rename that to be inside box. So rename that layer to be inside box. So you can change that as you see fit. I mean, it looks a little dark, so it might be something that again is too distracting. So if you need to change that so that it doesn't look too distracting, but it still looks like it's covering the inside of that box, exercise your own discretion to be able to achieve that. The final thing that we're going to do is the reflection. Now the reflection will take it from being a 3D mock-up sort of sitting there on this almost floating surface. The shadows created somewhat of a surface, but not enough to sort of really give that essence of it being on a table. The reflection will instead do that. So with our reflection, we're going to do it side by side. So since our front of pack and our side of pack are the only ones that connect with the base, they're the ones that we're going to reflect. So if you go to your front of pack, what you can do is you can duplicate that layer in any of the ways that I showed you before. I'm just going to go Command J, drag that duplicated layer all the way down underneath your grouping folders so that it's and maybe even below the shadow as well. That's probably advised. So drop it so that it's all the way down under the shadows. Then you've got if you've done and been following along, you should have effects, bevel emboss as your the effects that we created before when we were doing the layer styles on it. You can just delete those because we don't need those. They're not really going to make a difference when we do our reflection. With the front of pack duplicated down the bottom under your shadows with the effects layers deleted, go Command T, which will create the free transform. Then holding down Shift, make sure you go to your top right until it creates this sort of shape that shows the rotational mode, and then rotate it just 180. And then you can drag it all the way down to the bottom so that it's underneath your pack. Now the first thing you'll notice is that obviously it's not aligning with the front of pack design. So the ticks over here, and the weight statements up here. So all we need to do to change that is with your free transform still selected, go to Transform, Flip Horizontal. And then drag it down so that your bottom left is down there and aligned with the bottom left front of pack. And then for us to actually get that right side of pack so that it can align up with the top right there, you'll hold down Option, Shift, and click on the middle anchor point or the middle directional point here until it looks like this. It'll look like a white arrow with an up-down arrow image when you hover over that. And that will uniformly allow you to drag that up to that corner. Now you might need to make some small adjustments on your left-hand side by also holding down Command, Shift, and then bringing that back down so that that connects there. And the other thing too that is that although it's it seems like it's directly copied, so this angle bowing out quite far is the same as this angle bowing out quite far. You can leave that as is, and that's fine, or you can actually bring that in down the bottom so that it's more like a parallel line, so that it runs vertically up and down. So with those edges now done, if you want to, you can also go to your transform and warp tool and bring it so that that pack sort of comes down a little bit so it looks like it's actually completely mirroring that. So you can see that by just using the warp tool, I've pinched it down so that it looks like a direct reflection. And then after I'm happy with the transformation, I go Enter. Now with that already done like that, so you should have what looks like the start of your reflection there. We want to obviously strip it back so that it looks like a reflection and not just a complete mirror of that front of pack. So we'll go down the bottom here of our layers and click Add Layer Mask. Then get your brush tool by selecting B, or up here where you can actually select the tool itself. Make black your foreground color. And then just mask out as much as you feel you want to mask out so that it creates this gradient up. You don't want to mask out too much, otherwise it defeats the purpose of having the reflection itself, but you don't want to mask too little so that it looks like it's just running off the page. Because if this is floating on, say, your final portfolio page, you don't want it to be cropped off by the bottom of the artwork there. So having it so that it vignettes enough so that it's showing a little bit, but not too much, is optimal. And then the last thing that you need to do is just drop the opacity. So you'll bring the opacity down to, say, 30%, and there's your reflection. So now, since we've got that for the front of pack the way that is, we do exactly the same thing on the left side of pack. So you go to your side of pack folder. You don't have to necessarily worry about the shadow. If you want to use the shadow as part of that reflection and you really feel like it's important to add to the real nature of that shadow, all you do is you, instead of just selecting and duplicating that side of pack, you'll select both the shadow and the side of pack, duplicate both, go up to the top right corner here, and then go merge layers, or Command E. And all that'll do is just simply merge your shadow that's over the top of that side of pack with your side of pack image. Then you drag that all the way down so that it's down underneath the shadows. You'll go Command T, go up to the top and hold Shift so that when the rotational arrow or icon is selected like that, you can just simply rotate it around. Then you'll drag it down to the bottom of your side of pack there. You'll go Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Align the bottom corner not only with the edge of that existing reflection there, but also that corner of the front of pack, side of pack convergence. Then holding down Command Shift and hovering over that and selecting that area there on the side of your transform, drag that all the way up so that it aligns with that top edge. And then, exercising your own discretion, you can either choose to leave that where it was or bring it in so that it looks a little more vertical. So you can see there that it's looking all right. So I probably don't even need to warp that. It's looking quite good. But just make sure that there's no gap in that reflection there, because in much the same way that you need to make sure that the front of pack lines up with the side of pack, you need to make sure that there's no gap in the reflection, because sometimes that can show. And then you just click Enter. So once you've got that there, you want to add your layer mask to that side of pack reflection. Get your brush tool using B or selecting the icon. Make sure black is set to your foreground color. And then make sure that when you're doing your, when you're masking out of that layer mask, that you actually do it at exactly the same amount as the other one. So don't do it so that it's just a tiny bit down the bottom, because obviously there's not that much, there's more than that being taken out of the front reflection. So you need to make them both exactly the same, or as close as you can. So you can see that that's probably right for me. And then run it back so that it actually runs along that edge, so that it's as close as you can. And then once you've masked it out, then go up to your opacity, change that to be the same opacity as your other one. So in this case, the other one was 30%, so I'm making this one 30%. And you can also see that this has created a light spot here. Now I could leave that as it was, because essentially I actually have this highlight here, so it could mimic that highlight by making that gap or I can just nudge it across so that it's just slightly there and close as it can be to that edge there. Now the only other thing to do is to make sure that you can see now with the shadow, it doesn't look like it's actually on that reflection at all. So because the shadow was just floating on the white, but now that there's an object underneath it, we need to make sure that it's recognizing that object and not just shadowing to nothing. So we go back to our shadow layers and selecting each one at a time, go to your blending mode, go multiply, blending mode, multiply. And so what you can see there is that that is basically the essence of doing a 3D pack mock-up. So it's not really that hard, and each one of you are going to have your own ways of being able to achieve this. This is just the bare bones structure, and to show you that at the very least this is what I'd expect from the 3D digital mock-up. If you have more complicated ways or more complicated die lines that require something a little bit more intense than that, then let me know. Also, if you have a cylinder, I have a tutorial from one of the existing teachers who's got that available. So please let me know and I can show that to you. But for now, that's basically how you do a 3D